are in Acts chapter 9, and this is, I want to say, the most powerful conversion story ever. Yeah, and I've heard a lot of really good ones. In fact, I remember my pastor in Washington State, former Seattle Mariners player. He talks about his conversion, and he felt like God like flushed the toilet. His womanizing, drinking, all of the other stuff just kind of went away. Awesome story, but this is even more amazing. So again, we're in Acts chapter 9. We're going to kick off with verse 1, and it says this: but Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus. So who is Saul? Okay, so by now, hopefully you've been walking with disciples for the last several weeks, and you've spent time with me talking about Saul. We've heard of Saul several times, I think about 3 times already in the book of Acts. And Saul, we saw him at Stephen's stoning. He was the kind of the judge. He was the persecutor, right? He was the one that holding the coats for the witnesses, the robes for the witnesses. We hear him in Acts chapter 8, and it talks about that he was going into houses, and he was actually pulling people out of their homes because they were worshiping Jesus Christ. And because of the stoning of Stephen and then the persecution that came, we know that the Jewish Christians, Messianic Jews, had left Jerusalem. It says everyone had left but the apostles. So the only ones that were left were the apostles, the 12 disciples of Christ, right? So they were really the only ones kind of left in that area. Everyone else had spread out. And so here we find Saul. Saul's done his best to persecute those in Jerusalem. And then it's like he wakes up one morning, he looks around and goes, they're all gone. There's no one left, right? There's no one left for me to persecute. And so he goes to the high priest. And this point, we all know who the high priest is, or should, if you've been walking with disciples for a while. It's Caiaphas, okay? And so, again, we know the name Caiaphas from Jesus, right? The persecution of Jesus, the killing of Jesus, the arrest of Peter and John, and the trial of Peter and John, and the trial of the apostles. We know a lot about Caiaphas at this point. So Saul goes to Caiaphas and says, hey, give me letters to go to Damascus and arrest them and bring them back to Jerusalem. He's going to bring them back to Jerusalem so they could go before the Sanhedrin, before the council. Again, Caiaphas, Ananias, the others, right? The scribes and the whole thing. And so he goes to Damascus because at this point he's heard there's a lot going on in Damascus. And Damascus is about a 40-mile trip. Would have taken about a week on foot to get there. And so he's on his way. He says, give me this stuff. So at the end of verse 2, he says, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. He wanted to bring them bound. Now, I love that this is the first time we've heard this new, call it a religious sect, whatever you want to call it, the believers of Christ being called anything, and they're called the way. In fact, 4 times within the New Testament, we find out they're called the way. They're not called Christians until Antioch, until later on in the book of Acts is where we end up hearing this new name. But they were called the way. They were considered the way. And man, that is just so telling. Think about what we've been talking about walking with disciples. Think about what we were talking about with the book of James, becoming not just an ordinary Christian. What we talked about becoming nobody, like becoming a disciple. We've talked about that it's not just a label, it's a way of life. And it was such a way of life for these early Christians that's how they were known, as the way. So it says, so if he found any belonging to the way. Isn't that just what an awesome way to describe true Christianity? Man, I hope that's how they look at you and I. That when they look at us, they don't just say, "Oh, they're Christians." They're like, look at the way they walk, look at the way they talk, look at the way they act. Right? They're part of the way. And so And again, I promised the greatest conversion story in history of conversions, right? Well, here it comes, right? Because again, we got to understand who Saul was. Saul was zealous. He was persecuting, arresting, killing, murdering, right? I mean, he was doing bad things to Christians or bad things to the people of the way. And so it says in verse 3, now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. Now, it's interesting, if we get into the remainder of Acts, we're going to hear this story again. You read in Corinthians, you read in some of Paul's letters, he explains a little bit more of details than Luke does here on what happened. So we know one thing. We know this is about midday, so when the sun was the brightest. And he said, Paul says, or Saul, we'll call him Saul for now, he will become Paul, right? Saul says that it was bright outside, but that light that shone was even brighter than the sun. At the highest peak of the sun, that when the sun was the strongest, it was the highest. And he says that suddenly a light from heaven shone around, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So a couple things. So why did he fall to the ground? You would have fallen to the ground too if all of a sudden this massive light shines on you that you cannot stand. The light is so bright, you've got to cover yourself, right? The other thing to think about, it's interesting, is numbers mean things within almost anything, or numbers, or when things are repeated. Here we see that Jesus says to him, we'll find out it's Jesus in a minute. Jesus says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now, if you look through the life of Jesus, there's several times that he uses a double name, right? So he says, Martha, Martha. He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. It's a very emotional connection at that point. It's like, I don't know if you were ever called this as a kid when you got in trouble by your full name, James Levi Shulker. I know I'm in trouble. It was emotional. My mom was being emotional at that point. In that case, anger normally, right? But here Jesus is being emotional. He's emotionally invested in this, right? He says, and Saul's response to him is, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, but rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. So it's an interesting conversation. And there's a lot of debate on what he means by who are you, Lord? Did he really not know who he was? Or was he trying to confirm who Jesus was? Now, I'll tell you my take on the story, because we know from history, we know that more than likely Saul was part of the Sanhedrin. He was part of the group that persecuted or had Jesus on trial. We know for certain that he would have heard of Jesus. He probably would have heard Jesus's teaching if he was around Gamaliel, who we know it was part of that as well, who was his rabbi, right? Saul has already heard Jesus's voice. He already knows his mannerisms. He knows about him, and he's seen Peter and John, and he's seen the other apostles who said that they were Christ-like. They acted just like him. So in my opinion, and many scholars will agree that he already knew. It was a confirmation, like who are you, Lord? Right? I'm confirming who you are, right? And it's really about confirming the voices that we hear sometimes. At this point in history, they would talk about that that God never was not speaking ever to people. They talked about that had stopped with the Old Testament, with the prophets, but no longer. Now they would call it echoes of God. Right? It was an interesting term. And we hear echoes of God's voice, but we don't hear from him specifically. And so Saul's going, hey, this is not an echo. I actually hear the Lord's voice. And then Jesus says, hey, I'm Jesus. You know me. Okay. And Jesus was a common name. It's like, John, right? Just a common name. Or James, right? There's a lot of Jameses out there, but Jesus was a common name at that point. But Jesus didn't have to say, I'm Jesus Christ of Nazareth, right? He said, I'm Jesus. You know who I am. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But he tells them this, he says, rise up, go, into the city and do this. And this is in verse 7. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless. The men with him would have been like the temple secret service, if you want to think of it that way. They were the guys that Saul was going to say, hey, those guys are part of the way, arrest them, bound them, and we're going to take them back. So that's kind of what they were, right? He rolled with a posse, right? Honestly, that's what, think about it. You want to go old Western? He had a posse. You want to go New Day, right? He had a posse. He rolled big time. He had a lot of guys with him. And they said that they heard the voice, but they saw no one, which tells us that Saul saw someone. Saul saw Jesus, just like Stephen, right? And it says that Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were open, he saw nothing, right? So he had covered his eyes because the light was so bright. And then finally, when Jesus was done and said, hey, this is what I want you to do, he gets up and he opens his eyes, he can't see anymore, right? It had so blinded him, even with his eyes shut, right? Which is very interesting for a couple of reasons. And I'll get to that in just a second. Let me finish the verse here. And so he says he rose. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. There's that 3 again. There's another opportunity to see that God is working. God is revealing himself through creation. So what's the deal about his eyes? Now, understand something. Okay. So the eyes, again, the windows to the soul. Okay. So what do we know about Saul? Saul was blind. Now, I'm not talking physically blind at this point, but I'm talking spiritually blind. Okay. So what do I mean by that? Remember, everything he did, everything Saul did, he was doing for God, or believed he was doing for God. He was so zealous. He was so eager to persecute those that were following the way, were Christians, that he was doing this, but he was spiritually blind. And how telling is it that when Jesus appears, Saul covers his eyes and says, I'm not going to look at the glory of God. I'm pausing. The video did not freeze. I'm pausing. I want you to think about that. He so covered himself. He said, I'm not going to look at the glory of God. And then finally, when he gets up to look, he can't see at all. Do you not think God is trying to tell him something? Jesus is trying to tell him something. Hey, you've been blind this whole time. You've not really looked into my presence. You've not really looked towards me. You've been looking to yourself, your own beliefs, your own hopes and dreams, right? And that is telling to you and I that when we walk and we do what we're doing, that we need to make sure that we're not covering ourselves to the glory of God. We're not covering our eyes as well to say, I don't want to see that, right? I think so often there are times that we know the truth. We know that if we would just look in this direction and allow God to speak to our hearts, right? The eyes are windows to the heart, that we would allow him to speak to our hearts, right? We would change, but we've got blinders on because we don't want to see that because it might change us. And here we find Saul having the most massive conversion ever. And Jesus said to him, hey, you were blind before you got here to Damascus. Now I'm going to make you blind for 3 days, and then I'm going to bring you out into a new life. Hallelujah. I'm sorry, that excites me. So we're going to talk tomorrow about when he gets to Damascus and this man named Ananias and God's word to him. So love you guys. Talk to you tomorrow.